Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're here to crack open a stack of fascinating sources and pull out the absolute most important insights for you, our listener.
And today, we are really plunging into some seriously deep water.
Yeah, we are. We're comparing two absolute giants of non-dual thought, Mahayana Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta.
These are traditions that have, charted the depths of consciousness and reality for millennia.
Right.
And, well, at first glance, they seem to be saying things that are fundamentally contradictory.
They really do. I mean, on one side, you've got Advaita Vedanta. It's this incredibly influential school, right? Rooted in the Upanishads. And it tells us there's a single, universal, eternal self, the Atman. And the Atman is ultimately identical with absolute reality itself, which they call Brahman.
Yeah, it's a path of finding that oneness, a kind of radical affirmation, finding that singular, unchanging ground, pure consciousness.
Well, like, I am that sort of idea.
Exactly. Finding the one substance that is ultimately real.
Yeah.
But then you look over at Mahayana Buddhism, especially the Madhyamaka school, founded by the brilliant philosopher Nagarjuna.
Right.
And its central message is śūnyatā, emptiness.
Emptiness.
The teaching that absolutely nothing, not you, not me, not the universe, not even consciousness in the way we usually think of it, has inherent independent existence.
Wow.
Everything is empty of a fixed, self-sufficient nature.
And they call this Anatta or Anatman, right? No self, which sounds like a direct challenge to the Vedantic self.
It is, absolutely. So the big question we're digging into is, how can these two paths, one saying your true nature is the only real eternal self, this ultimate consciousness, and the other saying there is no inherent eternal self and everything, including consciousness, is empty. How can they both claim to lead to liberation from suffering?
That's the paradox, yeah. It's a powerful one, and our sources really dive into this.
And it's not just, some abstract modern debate either. The sources we looked at highlight that the dialogue between these traditions goes way back.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't always, let's say, friendly. There were periods of pretty intense philosophical jousting.
Really?
Yeah, some early Advaitins were even controversially labeled crypto-Buddhists.
No way. Crypto-Buddhists. Why?
Well, the accusation was that they borrowed key logical tools, particularly the deconstructive methods, from Buddhism to kind of refine their own system.
Huh. That adds a whole layer of historical spice, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay, so our mission here in this deep dive is basically to take this complex stack of material and help you, the listener, navigate it.
Right. We want to unpack what these sources show about where these two profound currents, diverge philosophically.
And where they might actually converge, maybe unexpectedly, in the actual practice, the path towards liberation.
We're trying to pull out the crucial insights, help you grasp the core ideas and why they matter, without, getting totally lost in the academic jargon.
Yeah, keep it accessible but deep.
And interestingly, right from the start, the sources point out a subtle but, well, pretty significant difference in the words they even use for non-duality.
Oh, like what?
Well, in Advaita Vedanta, the term is Advaita, literally not two.
Okay, not two. Seems straightforward.
But it's used not just descriptively. It's used to point towards a positive reality. A singular substance. It's about ontological monism, meaning ultimately there's only one thing, one fundamental reality, and that's Brahman.
Ah, so the negation, the not two, is actually a way of pointing towards a positive one? Is that it?
That's exactly the idea. It affirms this unified ground. Now, compare that to Buddhism, particularly Mahayana. The term often used there is Advaita.
Advaita also means non-dual.
It does, yeah. Also means non-dual. But the sources suggest its emphasis is a bit different. It's often understood more as an epistemic or phenomenological non-duality.
Epistemic, like about knowledge.
Yeah.
Phenomenological,
Yeah, about
that experience.
Right. It means freedom from conceptual extremes. Freedom from those dualistic frameworks we use to think like self and other, existence and non-existence, permanent and impermanent, even samsara and nirvana.
Okay, so it's less about finding one single thing that is reality and more about seeing reality itself as free from our usual mental boxes, our dualities.
Precisely. One points towards a singular ultimate substance that's Advaita's Advaita. The other points to the relational nature of everything and the freedom that comes when you step outside that dualistic thinking is more the flavor of Buddhism's Advaita.
That difference in terminology itself is a really interesting starting point. It hints at the deeper divergence.
It really does. It sets the stage nicely.
Okay, let's lean into that first perspective then. The Vedantic affirmation. Let's unpack section 1. The Vedantic affirmation. The self as absolute reality. This whole tradition seems geared towards finding the real behind all the apparent multiplicity.
Yes, exactly. Advaita Vedanta, which was largely systematized by the great teacher Adi Shankaracharya, drawing heavily on the ancient Upanishads. It's described in our sources as fundamentally a path of recognition. And this is crucial.
Recognition, not becoming.
Right. You're not trying to become Brahman. The idea is you're realizing what you already are. The potential isn't something out there you need to get. It's your innermost essence right now.
Okay. And the heart of this whole system is Brahman. Tell us more about how the sources describe this ultimate reality.
Sure. Brahman is presented as the ultimate, the absolute, the unchanging reality.
Okay.
And our sources really stress this isn't like a personal God figure sitting up somewhere.
No beard in the clouds.
No beard in the clouds, exactly. It's the formless, infinite, eternal ground of all existence. And in its highest form, they call it Nirguna Brahman.
Nirguna, meaning?
Without attributes. Guna means quality or attribute. Nir means without. So Brahman without attributes. It's utterly transcendent, beyond qualities, beyond time, space, causality. It's really beyond description, beyond thought.
But wait, if it's beyond description, how do they even talk about it? That seems like a paradox right there. That's where Sat Chidananda comes in, isn't it?
Exactly. You nailed it. Sat Chidananda. Existence, consciousness, bliss.
Right.
And our sources make a really important distinction here. These aren't qualities that Brahman has, like saying, a ball is round or blue.
Okay.
These are what Brahman is. Brahman is existence itself, Sat.
Yeah.
It is consciousness itself,
Yeah.
Chidit.
Yeah.
And because it's infinite, complete, perfect, its very nature is boundless bliss.
So it's not experiencing bliss, it is bliss itself.
Precisely. And this is the ultimate truth, what they call paramarthika satya, absolute truth.
Paramarthika satya. Okay. So from this absolute perspective, this paramarthika level, is anything else truly real? Like this table, this microphone, us?
Well, from that paramarthika standpoint, no. Only Brahman is ultimately real. The entire cosmos, with all its countless names and forms, everything we see, hear, touch, think, it's all seen as a projection, a superimposition upon this single indivisible reality, this ultimate substratum.
Like images on a screen.
That's the classic analogy used in the sources, yeah. Think of a movie screen. The images can be incredibly vibrant, complex, tell compelling stories, but their existence depends entirely on the screen.
Right. No screen, no movie.
Exactly. If the screen wasn't there, no images could appear. The names and forms of the world are the images. Brahman is the screen. Nothing in the world exists independently of that screen.
That's a really powerful way to put it. Okay, so Brahman is the ultimate universal reality. What about the individual? Me, you, where do we fit in? That's where Atman comes in, right? The self.
Yes, exactly. Atman is the true self, the inner core of the individual. And Advaita draws a very, very clear line here.
Okay.
Atman's not your individual ego, the jiva. It's not your body, not your mind, not your personality, your memories, your thoughts, your feelings.
So not the stuff we usually identify with.
Not at all. All that stuff is seen as transient, constantly changing phenomena. Atman, on the other hand, is the silent, unchanging witness consciousness. They call it the sakin.
Sakin. The witness. The pure awareness that just watches everything without getting involved.
That's the idea. It's the fundamental awareness that remains constant through all your different states of experience, when you're awake, when you're dreaming, even in deep, dreamless sleep. It illuminates experience like a light illuminates objects in a room, but it's never affected by the objects it illuminates. Thoughts come and go, feelings change, the body ages, but that core witness awareness just remains unchanged. Constant.
Okay. And the cornerstone, the absolute bombshell revelation of Advaita Vedanta is the connection between these two Atman and Brahman.
Absolutely. This is the profound declaration from the Upanishads. Atman is Brahman. Your true self, your innermost essence, is the absolute reality.
Wow.
This is what's captured in those famous Mahavakyas, the great sayings.
Like Tatvamasi.
Exactly, Tatvamasi, that thou art, pointing to the listener and saying, you, your true essence, are that reality Brahman, and also Brahmasmi.
Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. That's such a bold statement.
It really is.
And our sources emphasize this isn't saying like my little ego self is going to become Brahman someday through effort.
No, that's a key point.
It's saying my innermost essence already is that one reality. I just don't realize it. Is that it?
You've got it. It's a statement of pre-existing identity. Liberation, which they call moksha, isn't about achieving some new state or transforming into something else.
So what is it then?
It's about removing the ignorance, the avidya. That's the veil that prevents you from recognizing this fundamental truth of your own nature.
Removing the ignorance.
Shankaracharya used a wonderful analogy here. He says the soul, the Atman, appears finite, limited, and separate because of ignorance. Just like the sun appears obscured and less brilliant when it's covered by clouds.
Okay, I like that.
When ignorance is destroyed, when the clouds part, the self reveals itself in its full glory, shining brightly, just like the sun was always doing behind the clouds.
So the self was always there, luminous, just veiled.
Right.
Okay, so if Atman is Brahman, and Brahman is the only reality, then what is all this stuff, this world? Why do we experience all this multiplicity, this separation, this suffering? It feels pretty real.
Right, that's the obvious question, isn't it? It seems like a flat contradiction.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of Maya comes in.
Maya, the famous illusion.
Yeah, often translated as illusion, but it's maybe more nuanced. Maya is described as the cosmic power of illusion, or maybe creative power, or even ignorance. It's the power that, on the one hand, veils the singular reality of Brahman, and at the same time projects this seeming world of diversity, this world of separate objects, individual selves, and, yes, suffering.
So Maya makes the one look like the many. Is that a fair way to put it?
That's a very good way to put it. Our sources describe Maya as having this really peculiar status. It's neither ultimately real because only Brahman is ultimately real,
right,
nor is it completely unreal because, well, it causes the empirical world we experience every day.
So it's in between.
Kind of. It's often called indescribable or inexplicable, anarvakaniya. Its effect is to create what Advaita calls vyavaharika satya.
Vyavaharika satya.
Yeah, the transactional or empirical reality. This is the world we live and function in day to day. The world of cause and effect, of ethics, relationships, where things appear solid and separate and very much real to us.
Okay. And the classic example they use to explain this is the rope and the snake.
Absolutely. It's perfect. Imagine you're walking along a path in dim light and you see something coiled up ahead. You immediately think, snake, and react. Fear, adrenaline, maybe you jump back.
Yeah, heart pounding.
Right. But then maybe you shine a light or get a closer look and you realize, oh, it's just a piece of rope.
Relief.
Exactly. So the snake was an illusory superimposition. The technical term is atiropa, projected onto the real object, the rope.
Okay.
This mistake, seeing a snake where there's only rope, is caused by ignorance, avidya, about the true nature of the object, combined with the dim light, the context.
Makes sense.
But while you believed it was a snake, your reaction was real, wasn't it? The fear was real, the snake seemed real, it had effects.
Totally.
But then knowledge, jhana, arises. You shine the light, you see the rope clearly. What happens to the snake perception?
It just vanishes, it's gone. You realize it was never actually there.
Precisely. The snake perception is sublated. The term is apavada. It's revealed to have never had any independent reality. Only the rope was ever truly there.
So the world, the ego, the feeling of separation, these are like the illusory snake superimposed on the ultimate rope of Brahman Atman, all caused by the dim light of Maya or ignorance.
That's the analogy, yes. And this is important while you're still in that state of ignorance, living within the vyavaharika reality, the transactional world.
Yeah.
The snake feels real. Your reactions, fear, desire, grasping, suffering, are experienced as real.
Right.
Ethics matter. Actions, karma, have consequences within this framework. It's functionally real.
Until realization dawns.
Until the knowledge, jhana, arises. The light comes on, revealing the ultimate truth, the paramarthika satya. At that moment, the vyavahariga world and the individual ego are seen for what they are ultimately illusory appearances, playing out on the single, unchanging backdrop of Brahman Atman.
The snake is subbladed, only the rope remains.
Exactly. And it's interesting, our sources note that Shankaracharya didn't just see Maya as some kind of trap to escape. He actually saw it as a kind of ladder.
A ladder? How so?
Well, you use the very appearances that Maya projects the world, the scriptures, the teacher, spiritual practices. You use these relative realities to climb towards the absolute reality that Maya simultaneously veils.
Huh. Using the illusion to transcend the illusion.
Something like that, yeah.
So Advaita is fundamentally about penetrating the illusion to find and realize the singular, positive, conscious reality underneath everything. Now, let's step over to the other bank. Let's look at the Buddhist deconstruction, section 2. The Buddhist deconstruction, the emptiness of all phenomena. This feels like a completely different starting point.
It really is. If Advaita is built on affirming an ultimate reality, Mahayana Buddhism, especially the Madhyamaka school linked with Nagarjuna, is founded on a radical deconstruction. Its core insight is śūnyatā, emptiness, the lack of inherent independent existence in anything.
And the cornerstone of this, especially when looking at the individual, is Anatta, no self, which sounds like a direct rebuttal to the eternal Atman we just discussed.
It is a direct rebuttal. The Buddha taught Anatta, that's the Pali term, anatman in Sanskrit, as a fundamental characteristic of all conditioned existence. It directly counters the prevailing beliefs of his time, including those that fit into Vedanta, about a permanent unchanging soul or self.
So how does Buddhism arrive at this no-self idea?
Through introspection, through careful analysis of experience. The Buddhist path involves looking closely at what we conventionally call me or myself. And this analysis breaks down the person into 5 components or aggregates, the skandhas.
Ah, yes, the 5 skandhas or aggregates. Can you walk us through those again? What are they?
Sure. Our sources list them as the basic components that make up our perceived sense of being a person. First is rupa, form. This is basically the physical body, and by extension, the material world we interact with through the senses. It's tangible stuff.
Okay, matter.
Second, vedana, feeling or sensation. This is the raw, affective tone of experience. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? It's the immediate ouch or meh.
Got it. Feeling tone.
Third, sanya or sanya, perception or recognition. This is the mental function that identifies and labels what the senses encounter. Seeing a shape and color and recognizing it as red apple, hearing a sound and identifying it as birdsong.
Labeling, recognizing. Okay.
Fourth, saskara or saka. This is a tricky one, often translated as mental formations or volitional activities. It's a broad category that includes things like thoughts, intentions, habits, biases, impulses, basically. The active mental processes that shape our experience and drive our actions, creating karma.
The active shaping part of the mind.
Yeah. And fifth, vijnana, consciousness. But here, consciousness means the basic awareness that arises dependently on a sense organ and its object. Like, eye consciousness arises when the eye meets a visual form. Ear consciousness arises when the ear meets a sound. Mind consciousness arises when the mind meets a thought or feeling. It's not a universal background awareness here. It's specific moments of knowing tied to specific sense contacts.
Okay, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Those are the 5. And the big insight through meditation and analysis is that when you really look closely at these 5, you don't find any separate, enduring self-entity anywhere. Not inside them, not outside them.
That's exactly the insight. The person or self is seen as just a convenient label we apply to this constantly changing interdependent stream of these 5 aggregates flowing together.
Like calling a car a car.
Yeah, or the classic Buddhist analogy is a chariot. It's the chariot, the wheels, the axle, the frame, the pole.
No, it's all of them together, arranged in a certain way.
Right. There's no essential chariotness hiding somewhere independent of the parts and their arrangement. The self is viewed in the same way a useful conventional designation for this flow of psychophysical processes, but not a fixed independent reality in itself. It's a construct.
And this mistaken belief in a permanent, solid self is directly linked to suffering, or dukkha, in Buddhism.
Absolutely central. Our sources explain that this constant mental activity of I-making and mind-making, clinging to the idea of a solid, separate self, I am this, and possessively identifying with these transient aggregates, this feeling is mine, this body is me, is a fundamental root cause of suffering.
Because we grasp at things that are inherently impermanent.
Exactly. We grasp at the skandhas as if they're a stable self, leading inevitably to frustration, anxiety, and pain when they change, decay, or don't meet our expectations, which they always do because they're impermanent.
Okay, so anatta, no self, applies to the person. But Mahayana Buddhism takes this principle of emptiness much, much further, doesn't it? Applying it to all phenomena.
Yes, this is where the doctrine of pratyasamutpada comes in. Dependent origination.
Dependent origination. Everything depends on everything else.
In essence, yes. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything arises, exists, and ceases independence on causes and conditions. A tree needs a seed, soil, water, sunlight. A thought arises dependent on sensory input, memories, prior mental states, neuronal activity. Everything is interconnected, relative, conditional. Nothing stands alone.
And Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka founder, made that famous, powerful link between this idea of dependent origination and emptiness, śūnyatā.
He did, masterfully. In his foundational text, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Nagarjuna, argued that dependent origination is the very reason why things are empty. His famous line, often quoted in our sources, is, whatever is dependently co-arisen, that is explained to be emptiness.
Okay, so things are empty because they are dependently arisen, but empty of what, exactly? We need to be really clear here. It doesn't mean empty of existing altogether, like just poof, nothing's there.
No, and this is the most crucial point, and where misunderstandings often creep in. Empty does not mean non-existent in a nihilistic sense. It means empty of svabhava.
What's that again?
Svabhava means intrinsic nature, self-sufficient being, inherent existence. It's the idea that a thing has some kind of fixed, independent essence that makes it what it is, existing from its own side, somehow separate from its causes, conditions, parts, and our perception of it.
Okay, so things lack that independent essence.
Exactly. Our sources bring up the table analogy again, but with a Buddhist skin. A table appears solid, real, independent. But when you analyze it, where is its inherent tableness? Is it in the wood? Wood comes from a tree. Is it in the legs? The top? Those are just parts. Is it in the design? There's a concept. Is it in the function? That depends on us using it.
You break it down, and there's no single table thing you can point to.
Right. It's a collection of parts, dependent on causes. Wood, carpenter, design, dependent on conditions, gravity holding it together, dependent on our conceptual designation table. It exists conventionally, but it's empty of any independent inherent table essence.
And Madhyamaka says this applies to everything. Physical objects, abstract concepts, mental states, even consciousness itself.
Yes, absolutely everything. And this is a critical point of divergence from Advaita Vedanta. In Madhyamaka Buddhism, even consciousness, vijnana, remember it's one of the 5 skandhas, is seen as dependently arisen and therefore empty of inherent nature.
So consciousness isn't the ultimate unchanging ground like in Advaita.
Not at all. It's seen as a dynamic, flickering process that arises and ceases moment by moment dependent on conditions, sense organs, sense objects. Even refined states of consciousness achieved in deep meditation are, from this perspective, still conditioned phenomena, still part of the dependently arisen world, and therefore ultimately empty of inherent existence. They are not the final refuge or reality.
Okay, but still. Hearing that everything is empty of inherent existence, it sounds very close to saying nothing is really real. How does Madhyamaka avoid falling into just plain nihilism?
This is precisely why Nagarjuna named his school the Madhyamaka, the middle way.
Middle way.
Between what? Between the 2 extremes of philosophical views that Buddhism sought to avoid. The extreme of eternalism, Jadavadana, the belief that things have permanent, unchanging essences or souls, like an Atman or even a fundamentally real Brahman.
Okay, eternalism. And the other extreme?
Nihilism, which is the Vada, the belief that nothing exists at all or that things exist for a while and then are completely annihilated, especially the idea that there are no consequences to actions, no rebirth, etc.
So Madhyamaka tries to navigate between saying things are permanently real and saying things aren't real at all.
Exactly. Emptiness, śūnyatā, is the negation of inherent existence, of svabhava. It's not the negation of existence altogether. Things do exist, but they exist conventionally, relatively interdependently. They function, they have effects, we experience them.
Okay, so the table exists conventionally. We can use it, but it doesn't have some magical table essence.
Right. And here's the really profound, almost paradoxical twist that Nagarjuna pointed out, according to our sources. It is precisely because things are empty of inherent existence that they can function, change, interact, arise, and cease dependently.
Wait, emptiness makes reality possible? How does that work?
Think about it. If things had fixed, independent, unchanging essences, svabhava, they would be totally static. They couldn't interact, they couldn't change, they couldn't arise from causes or give rise to effects. How could a seed with a fixed seed essence become a tree with a fixed tree essence? How could anything grow, decay, or transform?
So if things were inherently real in that solid way, everything would be frozen.
Exactly. Change, causality, interaction, the very dynamism of reality depends on things lacking a fixed, independent nature. It depends on their emptiness, their potential to relate and transform.
Wow, okay, that flips the perspective. Emptiness isn't a lack, it's the condition for possibility.
Precisely. And crucially, this also makes liberation possible. If suffering or ignorance or the ego had a fixed inherent nature, it could never cease. It would be eternally real.
But because it's dependently arisen, because it's empty of inherent existence.
It can be transformed. It can be ceased. The path to liberation works because the things we're trying to free ourselves from are ultimately empty.
That's a very powerful idea. It reminds me of the Heart Sutra saying, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form.
Yes, exactly. That famous line captures it perfectly. Emptiness isn't some void behind or separate from the world of form and experience. Emptiness is the very nature of form. Form arises, functions, and appears precisely because it is empty of inherent existence.
So realizing emptiness, achieving nirvana, isn't about escaping this world.
No, it's about seeing this world, this very samsara, as it truly is, a luminous, dynamic, ungraspable dance of interdependent phenomena, completely empty of any solid, graspable core or self. It's a radical shift in perception, not a change of location.
And consciousness, Vijana, is just another dancer in that cosmic ballet, not the stage or the ultimate reality behind it all.
That's the crucial Madhyamaka distinction, yes.
Yeah.
Consciousness is part of the dance, dependent and empty like everything else.
Okay. So on the one hand, we have Advaita affirming a singular, ultimate, conscious being, Brahmanatman, as the only true reality. On the other hand, Mahayana, particularly Madhyamaka, deconstructing everything, including consciousness, as empty of any inherent independent existence. Philosophically, they really do seem miles apart.
They certainly appear to be, based on their core metaphysical claims.
Yeah. Our sources suggest something quite fascinating. They point towards a surprising convergence when you look at the actual experience of practitioners on these paths.
Yes. This brings us to section 3. The confluence of experience, where the paths converge in practice.
This is where the abstract philosophy meets, as you said, the rubber of direct contemplative practice. And the similarities in the practical journey are apparently quite striking.
They really are. Both traditions, despite their different endpoint descriptions, seem to start with the same fundamental diagnosis of the human problem.
Which is?
Suffering. And that suffering stems primarily from a fundamental internal error, identifying with a limited, separate self or ego that isn't actually who or what you truly are.
So the root of suffering is internal, based on a mistake about identity.
Yes. And the remedy, therefore, in both traditions involves a disciplined, often quite rigorous process of inward investigation and contemplative practice aimed squarely at dismantling this false identification.
Okay, how does that look in Advaita?
In Advaita, the practitioner uses tools like vichara, self-inquiry, like asking, who am I, and viveka, discrimination, to keenly discern between the true self, the Atman, which is pure awareness, and the non-self, the Atman, which is everything else, the body, the mind, thoughts, feelings, sensations, social roles, everything that can be observed as an object.
Sorting the real from the apparent.
Exactly. The practice is often summed up by the phrase neti.
Not this, not this.
Right. Systematically observing and letting go of identification with anything that is transient, mutable, and an object of experience. I am not my body. I am not my thoughts. I am not my feelings. It's a process of elimination, peeling back the layers of misidentification to reveal the underlying unchanging self.
Okay, so peeling away what you are, not to reveal what you are. And how does the Buddhist path approach this dismantling of the false self?
In Buddhism, particularly in the insight meditation traditions, vipassana, the practitioner uses mindfulness, sati, to cultivate a clear, non-judgmental awareness of the present moment's experience. They carefully observe the arising and passing away of the 5 skandhas form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness as they happen.
Watching the components of experience come and go.
Yes. And through this sustained observation, they gain direct insight, Prajna, into the true nature of these aggregates. That they are impermanent, anicca, inherently unsatisfactory or stressful when clung to dukkha, and lacking any permanent, independent self, anatta.
So they see directly that none of these components, individually or together, constitute a solid I or mine.
Precisely. They see the constructed, dependently arisen, and empty nature of what they previously took to be a solid self.
So even though the language is different, finding the self versus seeing no self, both practices seem fundamentally about letting go of grasping, letting go of clinging to a false sense of self.
Exactly. Both paths are aimed squarely at loosening and ultimately eradicating upadana, which means grasping, clinging, or attachment. This clinging is seen in both systems as the root cause of continued suffering and bondage within the cycle of birth and death, samsara.
So whether you frame the goal as dissolving the illusion of the individual jiva into the ocean of Brahman, or as realizing the selfless, empty nature of all phenomena, anatta, the core practical work seems to involve this deep letting go, this transcendence of the ego.
That's the convergence our sources point to, yes. The practice itself is about dismantling that ingrained habit of self-identification.
And where does this intense inward turning, this process of disidentification, typically lead experientially in both traditions? What does it feel like?
Well, the descriptions often point towards profound states of mental quietude, a deep inner silence that lies beyond the usual incessant chatter of the conceptual thinking mind.
The monkey mind finally quiets down.
Hopefully. In Advaita, this relates to the practice of dhyana, meditation, where the mind turns away from external objects and rests inwards towards the self.
And in Buddhism, you have practices like samatha and vipassana.
Right. Samatha is the practice specifically aimed at cultivating tranquility and concentration, stilling the discursive mind. This stillness then becomes the stable platform for vipassana, the insight practice, which penetrates into the true nature of reality.
So both traditions recognize that our normal thinking mind, the one that relies on concepts and dualities like subject-object, self-other, that mind is actually limited. It can't grasp the ultimate reality.
Exactly. The conceptual mind creates the very divisions that veil non-dual reality. So the path in both cases involves finding a way to quiet or see through that conceptual proliferation.
Which means that ultimate truth, whatever it is, must be non-conceptual. It has to be realized directly, not just thought about.
That's what both traditions strongly suggest. The ultimate realization isn't arriving at a better concept. It's a direct, immediate apprehension that often arises from, or is characterized by, this deep inner silence and clarity, free from conceptual filters.
How do they describe that state?
The language differs, naturally. Advaita might describe it as the unobstructed realization of the self, a state where the knower, the knowing, and the known merge into one seamless reality.
Yeah.
Pure being consciousness.
Okay. And Buddhism?
Buddhism, especially Madhyamaka, might describe the result of insight practice as the pacification of all cognitive grasping and the pacification of conceptual proliferation. Pravanyaka. It's about the mind coming to rest from its habitual clinging and constructing.
So one talks about realizing something positive, the self. The other talks about pacifying something negative, grasping concepts. The framing is different.
Very different framing, yes. But the description of the resulting internal state often sounds remarkably similar. It's a state of mind free from the compulsion to constantly categorize, define, judge, and grasp. A state often described using words like luminous clarity, profound stillness, effortless presence, freedom.
And you can really hear the shared flavor, this underlying resonance, despite the different vocabularies when you listen to the great masters from both traditions, right? Our sources shared some powerful quotes.
They really do. You look at someone like Shankaracharya describing the realized self, he calls it the eternal witness, the consciousness that impartially observes the waking, dream, and deep sleep states, but remains utterly untouched by them, fundamentally beyond mind and speech.
That pure witness.
Right. Then fast forward centuries later to someone like Ramana Maharshi, a modern Advaita sage. His core teaching was relentless self-inquiry. He'd constantly push people back with the question, who am I?
Not looking for an intellectual answer, though.
No, not at all. The point wasn't to find a concept like, I am consciousness. The point was that the very act of sustained inquiry, looking for the I, would eventually wear out the questioner, dissolve the egoic thought process, and reveal the silent, ever-present awareness that remains when the I thought ceases. He'd say things like, you are awareness. Awareness is another name for you. Since you are awareness, there is no need to attain or cultivate it. Or simply, be still.
Be still. That sounds incredibly simple, yet profound. It really resonates with that idea of the unchanging witness.
It absolutely embodies that Advaitic perspective of recognizing what's already present. Now, contrast that or compare it with voices from the Buddhist side. You have Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka philosopher. He described emptiness, śūnyatā, not as a nihilistic void, but as the relinquishing of all views.
Letting go of all fixed positions.
Exactly. Emptiness isn't another thing to believe in. It's the freedom that arises when you stop clinging to any conceptual standpoint about reality. And remember, he also spoke of emptiness as the very ground of possibility, the lack of inherent existence that allows for change, interaction, and liberation.
Right. Emptiness makes things possible.
Then look at a contemporary master like Thich Nhat Hanh from the Zen tradition, which is deeply influenced by Mahayana emptiness teachings. He spoke so beautifully about interbeing.
Interbeing.
Yeah. He used simple, poetic examples like look deeply into a sheet of paper. You can see the cloud that brought the rain. You can see the sunshine, the forest where the tree grew, the logger who cut the tree, the wheat for the logger's bread, the miller.
Everything is connected.
Everything is connected. Nothing exists by itself. His key phrase was, to be is to interbe. You cannot just be by yourself alone. This profound realization of radical interdependence, which stems directly from seeing the emptiness of any separate, independently existing self or thing, naturally fosters deep non-attachment, but also a powerful sense of connection and universal responsibility.
Wow. So one tradition points to an ever-present, unchanging awareness as our true core. The other points to radical interdependence and the lack of any independent core in anything. The focus seems so different.
The philosophical focus is definitely different.
But both paths seem to lead to a state where that fixed, separate, suffering sense of I dissolves, and reality is experienced in a fundamentally non-dual, interconnected, and liberated way.
Yes, this shared outcome, or perhaps shared direction, is really significant. Both traditions involve a core practice that could be called de-reification.
De-reification, making things less real.
Less solidly real, less inherently existent. It's a practice of ceasing to treat concepts, mental states, perceived objects, and especially the sense of self, as if they are fixed, independent, enduring things.
Okay. How does Advaita do that?
Advaita uses de-reification to dissolve the apparent reality of the world and the individual ego, jiva, revealing them as ultimately illusory superimpositions on the one truly real, unchanging substratum, Brahman Atman. It de-reifies the unreal to reveal the real.
Okay, and Buddhism?
Buddhism, especially Madhyamaka, takes de-reification all the way. It applies it radically to everything.
Everything.
Everything. Physical objects, mental states, the sense of self, consciousness itself, philosophical concepts like causality or nirvana. Even the concept of emptiness itself is seen as empty of inherent existence. The aim is to leave absolutely no ultimate thing, no conceptual ground, no subtle object for the mind to grasp onto. Total letting go.
Wow, that's thorough.
It is. But notice, the initial stages of the practice, calming the mind, observing thoughts and sensations without identifying, letting go of attachments to outcomes or experiences, our sources suggest these practical steps are often remarkably similar in both paths.
So the how-to of the early meditation practice might look almost identical.
Very often, yes. It's the philosophical framework used to interpret the process and the ultimate goal that differs so sharply.
So is it possible that the final states they describe Advaita's emphasis on the fullness of being, pure consciousness, oneness, versus Buddhism's emphasis on the freedom of emptiness, liberation from all standpoints, could these actually be different descriptions of the same ultimate ineffable reality? A reality where the fundamental subject-object duality has completely collapsed?
That's certainly a possibility that some commentators and practitioners suggest, especially given the experiential overlaps. A state beyond our dualistic concepts might be described affirmatively, it is pure being, or negatively, it is empty of all limitations, depending on the approach.
Which brings us squarely back to that fundamental philosophical disagreement. Section 4. The philosophical divide. Substratum versus no substratum. Because despite those intriguing experiential parallels, our sources are clear. The core intellectual disagreement about the ultimate nature of reality remains pretty stark.
It really does. You can't easily paper over this difference. Advaita Vedanta's entire system is built, as we said, on an ontological foundation. It makes a positive, unequivocal affirmation of an ultimate, unchanging substratum as the sole, fundamental reality. That is Brahman.
The one reality?
Yes. Brahman is Paramarthika Satya, the absolute truth. It's described as self-existent, Svayambhu, beginningless, endless. It cannot ultimately be negated because its existence, it is consciousness, its absolute monistums, fundamentally only one substance. Pure consciousness is ultimately real.
And liberation, Mukha, in Advaita is nothing less than realizing your inherent identity with this one ultimate substance.
Exactly. The path involves piercing through the veil of illusion, Maya, to uncover and then abide as that abiding singular reality beneath or within all the flux of appearances. You're looking for and finding the stable ground.
Okay. But Madhyamaka Buddhism takes a radically different view of any kind of ultimate ground or substratum.
Fundamentally different. From the Madhyamaka perspective, the very act of positing any ultimate substratum, any unchanging ground or essence, even something as profound and subtle as Brahman or pure consciousness, is seen as a form of clinging, a very subtle form. Perhaps the most subtle, but still a form of conceptual grasping.
So believing in Brahman is still grasping?
From the Madhyamaka viewpoint, yes. Clinging to the idea of a permanent ultimate ground is seen as falling into the philosophical extreme of eternalism, Shishvatavada, which Buddhism explicitly aims to refute.
So the Buddhist goal isn't to find a hidden reality behind appearances?
No. The goal is to understand the true nature of the appearances themselves, to see them directly for what they are. Dependently arisen, impermanent, interconnected, and utterly empty of any inherent independent existence. The Buddhist path isn't about finding a hidden substance. It's about dissolving the illusion of substance in all phenomena, leaving nothing to grasp.
And Nagarjuna was adamant about this, wasn't he? About not turning emptiness itself into another thing to grasp.
Absolutely. He famously warned that emptiness śūnyatā is taught as the relinquishing of all views. But if someone then holds on to emptiness as a view, as a philosophical position or a subtle object, then that person, Nagarjuna says, is incorrigible. They've achieved nothing. Emptiness is the medicine to cure the disease of holding views. It's not meant to become another disease.
So from this Madhyamaka perspective, the Advaitic concept of Brahman, seen as an ultimate, self-existent, conscious reality, might be considered a highly refined, very sophisticated philosophical view. But still, ultimately a view, a position that needs to be relinquished for final liberation.
Yes, that's precisely the Madhyamaka critique that emerges from our sources. They would argue that while the experience pointed to by Advaita, the realization of a pure, unchanging witness consciousness is undoubtedly a profound and transformative state, it might still be considered a very refined meditative attainment, sani, that occurs within the realm of conditioned existence, within samsara.
Even pure consciousness is seen as conditioned.
From the Madhyamaka standpoint, yes. That pure consciousness, chit or upman, could be analyzed as a particularly subtle manifestation of vijnana, the consciousness aggregate, skandha, which, like all skandhas, is dependently arisen and therefore empty. True liberation, nirvaita in the Madhyamaka understanding, requires seeing the emptiness of that consciousness itself, not abiding in it as an ultimate reality.
Wow. Okay, that really crystallizes the core intellectual disagreement. One says pure consciousness is the ultimate reality. The other says ultimate reality is realizing the emptiness of that consciousness and everything else. Let's really nail this down using the key points from that comparison table our sources provided. It laid it out so clearly.
Agreed. That table is very helpful for seeing the distinction side by side. Let's run through it conversationally.
Okay, first.
Ultimate reality. Advaita posits a singular, eternal, self-luminous, pure consciousness, Brahman, as the absolute ontological ground. It is being itself.
Whereas Buddhism, specifically Madhyamaka, posits the emptiness of all phenomena, the radical absence of any inherent essence or unchanging ground. It's about freedom from fixed being, not finding a fixed being.
Right. Second, nature of self. Advaita asserts the true self, Advaita, is real, eternal, unchanging, and identical to Brahman. The individual ego, jiva, is just an illusory appearance based on ignorance.
Buddhism counters with Anatta. There is no permanent independent self. What we call self is just a temporary, dependently arisen flow of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, the skandhas, empty of a core.
Third, how they view the phenomenal world. Advaita sees it from the absolute perspective as an illusory appearance, maya superimposed on the reality of Brahman like the snake on the rope, ultimately unreal.
Buddhism sees the phenomenal world as a web of dependently originated phenomena. These are empty of intrinsic existence, yes, but they are conventionally real and functional. The world isn't just an illusion to be dismissed, its empty nature is to be understood.
Fourth, the nature of ignorance, avidya. In Advaita, ignorance is primarily the failure to recognize the inherent identity of one's true self, Atman, with the ultimate reality, Brahman. Misidentification.
In Buddhism, ignorance is primarily the grasping at inherent existence, svabhava, believing that the self and phenomena have a solid, independent reality that they actually lack. It's about clinging to illusions of permanence and substance.
Fifth, the path to liberation. Advaita emphasizes jnana yoga, the path of knowledge or wisdom, which culminates in the direct, unwavering realization of identity with Brahman, Brahmasmi.
Buddhism follows the Noble Eightfold Path, cultivating wisdom, prajna, ethical conduct, sila, and mental discipline, samadhi. The wisdom aspect involves seeing the Four Noble Truths and realizing emptiness, śūnyatā, leading to nirvana, the cessation of suffering, and the cycle of rebirth.
And finally, sixth, the crucial role of consciousness. Advaita sees consciousness, chit, as the ultimate unchanging reality itself, the very nature of Brahmanatman. Consciousness is the ground.
Whereas Buddhism sees consciousness, vijnana, as one of the 5 conditioned skandhas. It's dependently arisen, impermanent, and empty of inherent nature. It's part of the process to be understood and seen through, not the ultimate reality to abide in.
Yeah, seeing it laid out like that is quite striking, isn't it? It really underscores how Advaita culminates in this profound affirmation of an ultimate conscious being, while Madhyamaka culminates in a radical freedom from all ontological positions, including the position of an ultimate being.
Okay, so we have this deep philosophical divide, particularly on the nature of ultimate reality itself. Is it being or emptiness? But we also saw these striking similarities in the practical path, the methods of dismantling the ego, and perhaps even in the descriptions of the liberated state. How do we reconcile this? Are they just irreconcilable opposites? This brings us to section 5, the unspeakable truth. 2 dialects of the ineffable. Maybe the reconciliation lies beyond words.
That's exactly what this section in our sources explores. It suggests that the key might lie in something both traditions profoundly agree upon. That ultimate reality, whether conceived as Brahman or understood through śūnyatā, utterly transcends language, concepts, and the entire structure of conventional dualistic thought.
Why is it beyond language?
Because our ordinary language and thought processes are fundamentally built on duality, subject versus object, self versus other, existence versus non-existence, before versus after. These distinctions simply don't apply or collapse in a non-dual reality. Language creates divisions where ultimately there may be none.
And Shankaracharya himself, the great systematizer of Advaita, basically admitted this, right, after building this incredibly intricate philosophical system.
He did. There are quotes attributed to him where he says something like, "The treasure I have found cannot be described in words. The mind cannot conceive of it." His whole elaborate philosophy is presented as a kind of ladder, a necessary tool to guide the mind and remove misunderstandings. But the actual realization is a direct, non-conceptual apprehension that leaves the latter behind. It's beyond the philosophy itself.
And Nagarjuna's approach seems designed to show the limits of language from the get-go.
Absolutely. His entire dialectical method, systematically dismantling every possible conceptual position about reality. It exists, it doesn't exist, both, neither. Is designed precisely to demonstrate the inherent inadequacy, the bankruptcy of the conceptual mind when it tries to grasp ultimate truth.
He's showing you can't think your way there.
Exactly. Truth, for Nagarjuna, isn't an object to be known by the mind in the usual subject-object way. It's more like a fundamental transformation of knowing itself, a state of being free from intellectual formulation and grasping.
So, since direct description is impossible, both traditions end up relying heavily on a via negativa, a way of negation, to point towards the truth. But they seem to apply it quite differently.
Yes, that's a key insight from the sources. Both use negation, but with different aims and scope. Advaita famously uses neti, not this, not this.
We talked about that, negating identification with body, mind, etc.
Right. It systematically negates everything that the self is not, everything that is objective, phenomenal, transient. This process progressively eliminates all possible objects of identification, guiding the seeker's attention back towards the pure, attributeless subject, the unchanging witness, the Atman. So it's a negation process designed to clear the ground for the recognition of a positive reality, the self, which is existence, consciousness, bliss.
Okay, negating the false to reveal the true positive lurking behind it. And Madhyamaka's use of negation.
It's arguably far more radical, more thoroughgoing. Nagarjuna's method, often using the katuko, the fourfold logic or tetralemma we mentioned, it is not both, neither.
Yeah, showing all four are problematic.
It systematically dismantles all conceptual standpoints about the nature of reality. It doesn't just negate this, the phenomena, it also negates the idea of a positive inherently existing that, like Brahman, behind it. It exposes the inherent contradictions and limitations within the conceptual mind itself. It aims to leave absolutely no conceptual ground to stand on no inherently real self, no inherently real world, and critically, no inherently real ultimate ground like Brahman.
So it's not negation to find a positive ground, it's negation to show there is no ultimate conceptual ground at all.
That's the Madhyamaka thrust, yes. It's a negation that reveals the radical freedom of emptiness, the freedom from all fixed positions, not a negation that points to a positive substance behind the appearances.
Okay, one negates to affirm being, the other negates being itself, along with everything else to affirm. Emptiness. Freedom. How can those possibly be pointing to the same ineffable thing?
This is where that intriguing idea comes, in the idea of them being two dialects of the ineffable. Perhaps there are two different but ultimately complementary ways of addressing the same fundamental human problem.
Which is?
Human suffering caused by the mind's innate tendency to reify, to solidify, to treat fluid, dependently arising processes like thoughts, feelings, sensations, and especially the sense of self, as if they were solid, independent, enduring things. Particularly the reification of a separate, solid self, which leads to clinging, aversion, fear, and all sorts of suffering.
So they're like two different therapeutic strategies prescribed for the same core cognitive disease, the disease of taking our constructions too seriously, especially the self-construction.
That's a really helpful way to frame it, and it aligns with how some sources interpret the relationship. Advaita's therapeutic strategy could be seen as collapsing the object back into the subject. It essentially tells the seeker, stop identifying with the limited body-mind and the world of objects. Realize that you are, in fact, the one ultimate subject, the only reality, Brahman. You are that. It uses powerful affirmative language, being, presence, oneness, consciousness, to guide the seeker toward the realization, I am everything.
Okay, that's the Advaita strategy. Realize you are the ultimate subject. And Madhyamaka's strategy?
Its strategy is different. It's to demonstrate the utter emptiness, the lack of inherent existence in both the subject and the object. It guides the seeker to meticulously investigate the self, the world, consciousness itself, and to see directly that they are all dependently arisen, impermanent, and empty of any solid, independent core. He uses deconstructive analytical language, emptiness, interdependence, no self, not found, to guide the seeker towards the paradoxical realization, perhaps best expressed as I am Nothing, meaning no fixed independent thing can be found.
I am everything versus I am nothing, no thing. Those sound like opposites.
They sound like polar opposites. Conceptually, yes, but experientially, what is the result of truly, deeply realizing either of these?
Well, in both cases, it seems to be the cessation, the annihilation of the limited, separate, suffering ego self.
Exactly. That appears to be the shared practical outcome. Both paths, through seemingly contradictory means, lead to the dismantling of the illusion of the separate grasping self, which is the engine of samsaric suffering. Maybe the philosophical frameworks, the concepts of Brahman or śūnyatā are, as the Buddha famously suggested, like rafts.
Rafts to cross the river of illusion.
Right. Necessary aids for the journey. But once you've reached the other shore, the shore of liberation, free from suffering, you don't need to carry the raft on your back anymore. The intense debates about the specific design of the raft, whether it was ultimately made of being or emptiness, might become secondary, even irrelevant from the perspective of having arrived.
So the philosophies are skillful means, pointers, but not the destination itself. There are different languages trying to gesture towards a territory that lies beyond any map or language.
Precisely. Two different dialects attempting to articulate, or rather point towards, an unspeakable, ineffable truth. A reality free from the burden of a reified self. A reality where perhaps emptiness isn't a dead void, but shines with a kind of pure, unconditioned presence.
Which brings us beautifully to our conclusion, and that powerful metaphor our sources use to try and capture this: 2 doors, 1 unconditioned room.
It's a really evocative image, isn't it? It helps synthesize these complex ideas. We've journeyed through 2 incredibly sophisticated, profound paths, both honed over millennia, both designed to guide seekers beyond the inherent limitations of the ordinary dualistic mind.
And we've seen how their philosophical starting points and their ultimate descriptive languages differ quite significantly. One emphasizes the affirmation of an ultimate singular consciousness,
while the other emphasizes a radical deconstruction leading to the realization of universal emptiness.
But despite these differing frameworks, the ultimate aim seems identical: the complete cessation of suffering and the transcendence of the illusory, limited, separate self.
Yes, and the suggestion is that perhaps, for those who actually reach that ultimate state, the one who has direct, unmediated realization for the mystic, the sharp distinctions between the concept of Brahman and the concept of śūnyatā might dissolve.
Doctrine falls away in direct experience.
That seems to be the implication. What remains is not a doctrine, not a belief system, but a state of being, a state that is fundamentally unconditioned, utterly free, silent, whole, and complete. The intellectual frameworks, however brilliant and necessary they were for the journey, are ultimately just fingers pointing at the moon of that direct experience. You don't mistake the finger for the moon.
So tell us more about this 2 doors metaphor. How does it work?
Well, our sources describe Advaita Vedanta as representing, metaphorically speaking, the door of absolute affirmation. The key to unlock this door is the profound realization, I am that, tat tavamasi, aham brahmasmi. Realizing your inherent identity with the one all-encompassing conscious reality. You enter this door by seeing the self, the absolute reality in everything and as everything.
Okay, the door of I am that in Mahayana Buddhism.
That's described as the door of radical negation. The key to this door is the deep insight summarized perhaps as I cannot be found, realizing the emptiness, the lack of any inherent self or substance in all phenomena, including oneself. You enter this door by seeing through the illusion of inherent existence everywhere, leaving nothing solid to grasp.
2 very different keys, 2 very different doors. But once you step through either door into the unconditioned space beyond,
the argument about which door was the correct one or which key was better potentially becomes secondary, maybe even meaningless. The view from inside, the sources suggest, is simply undivided reality itself, reality experienced directly, free from the dualistic concepts and frameworks that define the paths leading in.
And from that vantage point, maybe the apparent contradiction dissolves. Maybe Vedanta's ultimate fullness is Buddhism's ultimate emptiness.
That's the provocative suggestion, that the radiant fullness of being discovered through the Vedantic path of affirmation might be experientially indistinguishable from the radical freedom of emptiness discovered through the Buddhist path of negation.
Vedanta's fullness, Buddhism's emptiness. Wow.
Yes. Perhaps they are, at the deepest level, speaking different dialects about the same ultimate ineffable reality. One perspective sees the radiant light of an all-encompassing, pure, primordial consciousness. The other sees the luminous, ungraspable, infinitely creative dance of an empty, interdependent universe. Are they truly at war? Or are they complementary visions, two ways of describing the indescribable?
It really shifts the perspective from conflict to complementarity. And there was that Zen quote you mentioned that seemed to bridge the gap.
Yes, a beautiful quote often cited in these discussions attributed to Zen sources. All is empty, clear, self-illuminating with no exertion of the mind's power.
Let's break that down.
All is empty. That's the śūnyatā insight, the lack of inherent existence. But it's not a dark void. It's also clear, self-illuminating, suggesting a kind of inherent luminosity, presence, awareness, maybe echoing the Vedantic chit consciousness. And it's realized with no exertion of the mind's power, pointing to the effortless, non-conceptual nature of the realized state beyond striving. It hints beautifully that ultimate emptiness isn't a negation into nothingness, but perhaps opens into a vibrant, self-aware clarity.
Empty, clear, self-illuminating. That really does seem to weave the threads together. It's truly remarkable how these two monumental spiritual and philosophical systems, starting from seemingly opposite poles, one affirming ultimate being, the other emphasizing ultimate emptiness, can guide practitioners through such similar internal processes of letting go and potentially converge in a state of liberation that, while described differently, might ultimately be the same non-dual reality.
It absolutely forces us to confront the inherent limits of our own conceptual frameworks, the limits of language itself, when we try to pin down the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness.
Yeah.
And it highlights something profound, that the deepest truth about existence can sometimes be approached and perhaps even realized via paths that look, on the surface, completely contradictory.
So what does this whole deep dive mean for you, our listener, grappling with your own experience? These aren't just, dusty philosophies locked away in ancient texts.
Not at all. They are living traditions offering incredibly sophisticated maps for understanding our most fundamental human questions. Who or what am I, really, beneath the surface personality? What is the true nature of this world I experience? And, perhaps most urgently, how can I find lasting freedom from the suffering and dissatisfaction that seems so woven into human life?
And this exploration really drives home the point that even the wisest traditions, when grappling with these ultimate questions, openly acknowledge that our thinking mind, our conceptual frameworks, the very language we use, they ultimately fall short. They can't fully capture or contain the final truth.
So a provocative thought to leave you with, drawing from these themes. If language and concepts ultimately fail to grasp ultimate reality, what does that imply about our everyday efforts to understand ourselves, others, and the world solely through definitions, categories, labels, and fixed ideas?
Yeah, how much do our concepts limit our experience? And what about this idea of de-reification? What might happen if we started, even in small ways, to see through the apparent solidity of things, including our own cherished sense of self?
If the self isn't this fixed, independent entity we usually assume it is, how might that change our experience of suffering, which is so often tied to defending, promoting, or worrying about that perceived self? Could suffering itself start to feel less solid, less permanent, less personal?
And maybe the most profound question these traditions implicitly or explicitly pose, albeit in their distinct ways, is the ultimate truth something you know, like, an intellectual fact or a piece of data? Or is it something you are, a fundamental shift in being, a realization that transforms your very relationship to reality?
Powerful questions to ponder, questions that flow directly from the heart of these deep, challenging, and potentially liberating traditions.
We really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable perspectives and maybe sparked some insights as you navigate these profound territories. We certainly encourage you to explore these ideas further in your own way. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.